February 22, 1986, 6:30 p.m. Juan Ponce Enrile stood before television cameras at Camp Crame, about to say words that would end a 20-year partnership and destroy the most powerful man in the Philippines. Behind him, 300 rebel soldiers waited for orders. Across Manila, Ferdinand Marcos sat in Malacañang Palace, still believing that his most loyal enforcer was preparing to crush another rebellion. But Enrile wasn't there to defend Ferdinand Marcos. He was there to destroy him. "I cannot in good conscience continue to serve a government that has lost the moral authority to lead," Enrile declared to the cameras. "President Marcos no longer represents the will of the Filipino people." With those words, the man who had been Ferdinand Marcos's sword and shield for 2 decades became his executioner. This wasn't just political betrayal. This was the ultimate treachery by the person who knew all of Marcos's secrets, had implemented all of his crimes, and had been trusted with all of his power. This is the story of how Juan Ponce Enrile spent 20 years building Ferdinand Marcos into a dictator, then destroyed him in 20 minutes. To understand how devastating Enrile's betrayal was, you need to understand what Juan Ponce Enrile had been to Ferdinand Marcos. He wasn't just a cabinet member or political ally. He was the architect of authoritarian power, the man who turned Marcos's ambitions into reality. When Marcos won the presidency in 1965, Enrile was already his most trusted advisor. As a brilliant lawyer who had studied at Harvard, Enrile understood both Philippine law and American legal systems. More importantly, he understood how to use legal language to make illegal actions seem legitimate. Their partnership began in 1966, when newly elected President Ferdinand Marcos was looking for a defense secretary who could help him consolidate power. Juan Ponce Enrile wasn't an obvious choice. He was a lawyer, not a soldier. He was young, ambitious, and relatively unknown in national politics. But Enrile had 2 qualities that Ferdinand Marcos valued above all others: intelligence and loyalty. More importantly, he had no independent political base. He owed everything to Marcos, which made him safe. When Marcos offered him the position of defense secretary, Enrile accepted with the understanding that he wasn't just joining the cabinet. He was joining a conspiracy to transform the Philippines. Over the next 6 years, Enrile became Marcos's closest confidant and most effective instrument of control. While other cabinet members handled routine government business, Enrile handled the sensitive work, monitoring potential threats, neutralizing opposition leaders, and preparing for the day when Ferdinand Marcos would suspend democracy entirely. The planning for martial law began in 1970, and Juan Ponce Enrile was at the center of every discussion. He drafted the legal framework that would give Marcos unlimited power. He identified the military commanders who could be trusted to follow orders without question. He compiled lists of opposition leaders, journalists, and activists who would need to be arrested immediately. Most importantly, he helped Marcos create the justification for martial law, the communist threat that required extraordinary measures to combat. On September 21, 1972, when Ferdinand Marcos signed Proclamation 1081, declaring martial law, Juan Ponce Enrile was standing right beside him. Not just as a witness, but as a co-conspirator who had made it all possible. What followed were the darkest years in Philippine history, and Juan Ponce Enrile was Ferdinand Marcos's indispensable partner in implementing every aspect of authoritarian rule. While Marcos controlled the political narrative, Enrile controlled the security apparatus that made the narrative credible. Military tribunals that convicted government critics, intelligence operations that silenced journalists, detention centers that held political prisoners without trial. Enrile didn't just follow orders, he anticipated them. He understood what Ferdinand Marcos wanted before Marcos had to ask for it, and he delivered results that exceeded expectations. By 1975, opposition to martial law had been completely crushed, not through random violence or crude repression, but through systematic, intelligent application of state power. Juan Ponce Enrile had built the most effective authoritarian control system in Southeast Asia. Ferdinand Marcos rewarded this loyalty with complete trust and unprecedented power. Enrile wasn't just defense secretary. He was the second most powerful man in the Philippines. He controlled military promotions, intelligence operations, and internal security. He had access to classified information that even other cabinet members never saw. Most importantly, he knew where all of Marcos's secrets were buried: the financial crimes, the political murders, the systematic corruption. Enrile had been involved in planning or covering up most of it. This knowledge made him invaluable to Ferdinand Marcos, but it also made him dangerous. For most of the 1970s, this mutual dependence worked perfectly. Marcos had absolute political control, Enrile had enormous operational power, and the Philippines had stability at the cost of freedom. But by 1980, cracks were beginning to show. Not in their relationship, but in the system they had built together. The economy was stagnating under the weight of corruption and mismanagement. International pressure was mounting over human rights abuses. Opposition groups were becoming bolder, despite continued repression. And most dangerously, the military was showing signs of discontent with martial law. Juan Ponce Enrile, as defense secretary, was seeing these problems more clearly than anyone else. He was getting reports from field commanders about declining morale. He was hearing from intelligence officers about growing resentment among junior military personnel. He was watching the economic statistics that proved martial law was failing to deliver the prosperity it had promised. But when Enrile tried to discuss these concerns with Ferdinand Marcos, he discovered something troubling. Marcos didn't want to hear about problems. He wanted to hear about solutions that didn't require changing course. This was the beginning of the end of their partnership, not because of personal disagreement, but because Juan Ponce Enrile was beginning to understand something that Ferdinand Marcos refused to accept. Martial law was destroying the Philippines, and continuing it would eventually destroy them both. The first major crisis came in 1983 with the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. Enrile knew immediately that this was a catastrophic mistake, not because it was morally wrong, but because it was strategically stupid. Killing Ninoy Aquino turned him into a martyr and galvanized opposition that had been fragmented and demoralized. Worse, it damaged the Philippines' relationship with the United States, which was essential for maintaining international legitimacy. When Enrile tried to explain this to Marcos, the president's response revealed how far apart they had grown. Marcos wasn't interested in Enrile's strategic analysis. He was interested in loyalty, and loyalty meant supporting the official story about Aquino's assassination regardless of its credibility. For the first time in 20 years, Juan Ponce Enrile found himself publicly defending something he privately knew was indefensible. And he discovered that lying for Ferdinand Marcos was becoming harder than telling the truth about him. Over the next 2 years, this tension grew worse. The economy continued deteriorating, opposition continued growing, international pressure continued mounting, and Ferdinand Marcos continued demanding that Juan Ponce Enrile find security solutions to political problems that required political solutions. By 1985, Enrile was privately convinced that martial law had to end, not gradually, not conditionally, but completely and immediately. The system they had built was no longer serving the Philippines or even serving Ferdinand Marcos effectively. But when he tried to have this conversation with Marcos, he discovered something that shocked him. Ferdinand Marcos was no longer capable of strategic thinking. 20 years of absolute power had made him unable to consider any option except more power. This was when Juan Ponce Enrile began planning not just the end of martial law, but the end of Ferdinand Marcos's presidency. The planning was careful and methodical, exactly the way Enrile had planned martial law 15 years earlier. But this time he was planning to destroy the system instead of create it. First, he began building relationships with military commanders who shared his concerns about the direction of the country, not through dramatic recruitment, but through careful conversations that allowed him to identify officers who were ready for change. Second, he began documenting the full extent of Marcos' family corruption and human rights abuses. Not for prosecution, but for leverage that could be used to force Marcos to accept a peaceful transition. Third, he began reaching out to opposition leaders, not to join their cause, but to create channels of communication that could prevent civil war when the transition began. Most importantly, he began preparing for the moment when he would have to choose between Ferdinand Marcos and the Philippines, and he began preparing for the personal consequences of making that choice. The moment came sooner than he expected. In December 1985, facing international pressure and domestic unrest, Ferdinand Marcos announced snap elections for February 1986. He was confident that controlling the election machinery would allow him to defeat any challenger and prove his continued legitimacy. Juan Ponce Enrile knew this was a mistake. He understood better than anyone how unpopular martial law had become, especially among the middle class and educated professionals who would be most visible to international observers. When he tried to warn Marcos about the dangers of holding elections he might not be able to win honestly, Marcos's response was telling, "Don't worry, Johnny. We've been winning elections for 20 years. This one won't be any different." But this election was different. The opposition united behind Cory Aquino, creating a single powerful alternative to continued Marcos rule. International observers were preparing to monitor the voting and vote counting. Most importantly, the Filipino people were ready to risk everything for change. Juan Ponce Enrile watched the February 7th election with growing alarm. The fraud was massive and blatant, but unlike previous elections, this fraud was being witnessed and documented by international observers and broadcast live on television. Even worse, the fraud wasn't working. Despite stuffed ballot boxes, altered vote counts, and widespread intimidation, it was becoming clear that Cory Aquino had won by margins too large to steal credibly. When the official election commission tried to declare Ferdinand Marcos the winner, their own computer operators walked off the job in protest, declaring on live television that they were being ordered to falsify results. Juan Ponce Enrile realized that Ferdinand Marcos had just destroyed his own legitimacy on national television. And as defense secretary, Enrile would be expected to use military force to keep an illegitimate government in power. That's when he made his final decision. After 20 years of loyalty, he could no longer serve Ferdinand Marcos without betraying everything he believed about duty, honor, and service to country. February 22, 1986, 3 p.m., Juan Ponce Enrile called Ferdinand Marcos from his office at Camp Crame. "Sir, I need to inform you that I can no longer serve as your defense secretary." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then Marcos's voice tight with disbelief. "Johnny, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that the election was stolen. The people know it was stolen, and I cannot use the military to keep an illegitimate government in power." "Johnny, we've been through worse than this. Remember 1972? Remember all the crises we've survived together?" "That's exactly why I have to do this, sir. Because I remember what we built, and I remember why we built it. It was supposed to serve the Philippines. Now it's only serving us. If you do this, you're destroying everything we've worked for." "No, sir. If I don't do this, everything we've worked for will be destroyed anyway. This way, at least the country survives." 3 hours later, Juan Ponce Enrile held the press conference that ended Ferdinand Marcos's 20-year rule. Standing with General Fidel Ramos, who had joined the rebellion, Enrile announced their withdrawal of support from the Marcos government and called for Ferdinand Marcos to step down. But the most devastating moment came when reporters asked him about his 20-year relationship with Ferdinand Marcos. "I served President Marcos faithfully for 2 decades because I believed he was serving the Philippines," Enrile said. "When I realized that was no longer true, my choice became clear. My loyalty is to the Philippines, not to any individual." It was a carefully chosen statement that summarized the tragedy of their relationship. 2 men who had started with good intentions built something that had outlived its usefulness, and finally been forced to choose between friendship and country. Ferdinand Marcos chose friendship, Juan Ponce Enrile chose country, and that choice made all the difference. Within hours of Enrile's announcement, other military commanders began withdrawing their support from Marcos. Within 2 days, millions of Filipinos had surrounded Camp Crame to protect the rebels. Within 4 days, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos were fleeing the country in American helicopters. The government that had seemed invincible just a week earlier collapsed almost without violence, brought down not by armed revolution or foreign intervention, but by the withdrawal of support from the one man Ferdinand Marcos had trusted most. Years later, when historians analyzed the fall of the Marcos regime, they consistently identified Juan Ponce Enrile's betrayal as the crucial turning point. Not because of its military significance, but because of its psychological impact. If Juan Ponce Enrile, the architect of martial law, the enforcer of authoritarian rule, the man who knew all of Marcos's secrets, was willing to abandon Ferdinand Marcos, then Ferdinand Marcos truly had no legitimacy left. The betrayal that ended a dictatorship, the loyalty that finally chose country over friendship. The moment when Ferdinand Marcos's most faithful servant became his most effective enemy. February 22, 1986, 20 years of partnership. ended with one press conference, the beginning of the end of the Marcos era. Juan Ponce Enrile had learned something that Ferdinand Marcos never understood. Loyalty to a person should never supersede loyalty to principle, and when the two come into conflict, principle must win. It was a lesson that cost him his closest friendship but saved his country, and in the end, that was a trade Juan Ponce Enrile was willing to make. The defense secretary who defended democracy by destroying the dictator he had helped create, the loyal servant who committed the ultimate betrayal in service of a higher loyalty, 20 years of building power, 4 days of losing it, all because the man Ferdinand Marcos trusted most finally decided that trust had to be earned, not just expected, and Ferdinand Marcos had stopped earning it long before Juan Ponce Enrile stopped giving it.